that has the presentation, but also the notes. Yes. Okay. Excellent. So this is the presentation we created. It's been shared with everyone who is part of the Romeo, Malette, or Gordon Cosens mailing group, but we can certainly share it again. It's still in PowerPoint format. So if you wanted to make any changes to it specific to your community, you're more than welcome to do that. It's just meant to be an aid. So the intended audience is chief and council or to general community and presented by the lands and resource staff. Contents: who is FSC? What are conservation areas? How can Indigenous communities participate? And why does that matter? So you can see we included a lot of notes down here to help any lands and resource staff go through this presentation. So this first meaty section, I guess, is FSC, stands for Forest Stewardship Council. It's a third-party certification system, which means that they have a set of indicators for forest management that are above and beyond the ones regulated by the Ontario government or the MNR. One area where FSC indicators surpass government regulation is with requirements for industry engagement with Indigenous communities. And this is totally separate than the government consultation, but an indicator specifically for Indigenous engagement. And that's within the FSC rule set principle 3, Indigenous people's rights. So certifying a forest with FSC is a voluntary process, meaning that industry chooses to meet the FSC requirements and get certified so that they can sell their products on the market with the FSC logo on them. So this is something that Green First has chosen to do. I think on most, if not all of their forests, or the forests that they manage in our area. So forests are verified at the forest management unit or landscape scale. Currently, Green First is working to maintain their certifications on the Romeo, Malette, and the Gordon Cosens forests. This is an area that represents 2.7 million hectares, which must be considered to work towards the FSC standards. All certified forests are audited for compliance with the FSC standards on an annual basis, with specific indicators that include Indigenous engagement and working towards FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent. This gives an additional avenue to engage with Indigenous communities outside of the regular FMP process and on a more flexible timeline. So currently, as stated before, Green First is working on the gap analysis for the Romeo, Malette and the Gordon Cosens, which includes regular meetings with the lands and resource staff to do conservation planning and choose potential areas of conservation. Any questions on that slide? You can always ask them later as well. The next slide is, what is an FSC conservation area? Because that's kind of the focus of this gap analysis and conservation planning segment of FSC certification. So conservation areas are created by mapping out areas of the landscape that are taken out of industrial forestry and left alone. Conservation are intended to be permanent deferrals and would likely only change if the value no longer existed or when substituted by a more important or a different value. Could also potentially change if the industry player, I don't know the right words here, the certificate holder. So if Green First was bought out by another company that didn't want to be FSC certified or wanted to change the way that they were doing this. There's a 10% of the landscape requirement to be put into that conservation areas. And that's a minimum that must remain on the landscape for the company to be FSC certified. It's important to note that these voluntary conservation areas are used by forest industry, but the rules do not apply to a mining or energy company or other development. So in other words, just because Green First decided with the help of communities that a specific area is to be protected and left out of forestry. That doesn't mean that we can nullify any mining claims that are in that area. So just something to keep in mind. Because lands and resource directors or staff have to deal with multiple natural resource factors. So the areas being conserved are of ecological and cultural significance. The ecological significance is determined in a mapping exercise that looks at forest type, ages, proximity to other forest types, like a mosaic across the landscape. We look at water features, topography, species at risk, and habitat types. So that's all done through that big modeling exercise that we worked on together, but I think we don't even need to name what that whole process is for the purpose of this presentation. The culturally significant areas are determined using values information from local Indigenous communities, and this information can be updated at any time. Putting all of this information together on a map allows industry to identify which areas on the forest are the most significant to put into a conservation area. One goal is to make larger conservation areas instead of many small ones across the forest. So if you can lump ecological and cultural into one bigger area, there's more chance of that being conserved than a bunch of little tiny ones across the forest. Also note here, if previous harvest areas are included within the boundaries of a newly designated conservation area, there may be a legal requirement for the company to complete R&M. I think that's restoration. Aaron, can you help me out? What does the M stand for in R&M?
Not sure. R&M.
Okay. That's also a very technical note. My opinion is that you could probably leave that note out when you're giving this presentation, unless you're getting a lot of technical questions about, so what happens if there's an already harvested area included in a conservation area? I'm not exactly sure what R&M stands for, but I know it's restoration, meaning they would have to like replant an area that was maybe need or remediation. They would be legally obligated to fix anything in there that wasn't up to the standards. So there is going to be a little bit of activity taking place in there where it's supposed to be totally outside of industrial activity. They can do activity to fix any areas that are previously harvested, which is pretty technical, but any questions about this slide? And move to the next one. I've also included this as a big plotter size PDF. If you don't have it, I can send it to you again. Green First also has committed to printing and sending plotter size versions of this to anyone that would like them. But just for reference, all we're looking at here is the purple areas, which are existing FSC designated conservation areas within the two Romeo, Malette, and Gordon Cosens forests. So how to participate? You can participate in this gap analysis process by reviewing your community values and summarizing the areas that are most relevant for conservation. This information is then provided to Green First. However, it is up to each community how much or how little information you would like to include. It's acceptable to provide a polygon or even just drawn with a marker on a paper map that has no information about what values are inside, but is just kind of a boundary. These areas will be then taken into consideration for conservation, along with overlap of ecologically significant areas and areas identified by other Indigenous communities. So that's not to say that every single value that you identify will end up in an official FSC conservation area, but it certainly should be considered by industry of the best way to protect that value. It just might not align with the larger area that they're looking for a specific FSC conservation area. So FSC organizes audits for certified forests on an annual basis, and the feedback from Indigenous communities can be included as a part of the auditing process. So in addition to the MNR, who has the official duty to consult, there's a third-party FSC auditor who is looking at how the industry is complying with the FSC standards. So that includes these conservation areas. That's an annual audit, and input is permitted and encouraged at any time for those. If you have questions or concerns about the forest management in your territory, you can always contact your industry reps who are looking to form relationships with communities that involve two-way knowledge sharing. So that's a note from Green First in there to just open door policy on this kind of thing. They're hoping to continue the relationship and having discussions with community members about conservation areas, but also just any general conservation or value discussions. Any questions about this slide? Okay. Our second last slide is why does it matter? This is our, I guess, bottom line for when we're giving this presentation to chief and council or community members. Why should your community participate in this process? And that's because it's an additional opportunity to have our voices heard and to protect the areas containing values that are most important to our community. It helps build the relationship with industry so that they might better understand our cultural values and how to best take care of them. And these areas will be conserved, so they'll still be around for future generations, as well as protected for all of the creatures and plants that live in the forest. And then we end on more information. Here's some links to FSC, specific documents and their website, and all of our Green First reps for these two forests. And that's the end of the presentation. So I'm going to stop recording and ask again if we have any questions or comments